Welcome, everyone, to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. I am your host, Carter Laren, and I am joined, as always, by the bad mamma jamma, Keri Smith.
Hi, Carter.
Keri.
Hello, guys.
Welcome back to your own show.
Thank you. I'm a little under the weather, as you know, so I apologize in advance if anyone has to see me blowing my nose.
Well, as you said earlier, it's hard to be healthy in an environment of such toxic masculinity. So I understand completely. I'm sure the audience will understand. It's all good. By the way, I think for those of you who are pointing out my synchronization issues, I think the audio and video are synchronized. So if anyone sees otherwise, please let me know in chat. But I think we've solved the problem. Anyway, you can follow. We do Deprogrammed live every Thursday at 11 Pacific, which is 1 o'clock Texas time, yes. Keri, and you can catch us at those times, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Unsafe Show. You can go to unsafeshow.com. We're on Gab and Minds, and normally BitChute. We repost stuff on BitChute as well, and I don't know, where else are we? All these are turned into audio podcast formats, so you can go to your favorite podcast app and look for Unsafe Space. You should be able to find us. Okay. Keri.
Mm-hmm.
The American Psychological Association came out with these guidelines that we're going to talk about today.
Look at all your Post-it notes.
I have them. I went through them all. I even used a highlighter, which I haven't done for decades probably. But the guidelines are called the APA Guidelines for the Psychological Practice with Boys and Men.
Mm-hmm.
And, I guess on the one hand, I'm kind of... So people have been saying that there's some fake news about this. I'm not sure what the fake news is, but I guess there's been some backlash about this report. I just read the report. I didn't really read the fake news. Thank you, JD, whatever those numbers are. So anyway, I just read the report or the guidelines. I didn't read a lot of the news about it, so I don't know what's being said. But on the one hand, I think we can kind of look at this as a good thing because the APA is finally paying attention to men's issues. And so maybe that's positive, right? Ever since it became kind of fashionable to just blame almost everybody's suffering on the mythical patriarchy and toxic masculinity, discussing men's issues has been kind of taboo. So, when you hear, I saw a few years ago, Cassie J made a movie called The Red Pill, which was a great movie about men's rights and men's issues. Yeah. And I think she was vilified for that. People are, men's rights groups are routinely denounced for having the gall to even discuss that there are any issues that might affect men.
Just a note about Cassie J. If people haven't seen that, it's a great documentary. And one of the reasons I think it's so great is that she's a feminist filmmaker. She had a career as she was in the feminist movement, and she'd done some previous documentaries, and this one. She started out, unlike most documentaries these days, she didn't start out with an end goal in mind and just work her way there. She allowed her mind to change. So you see her mind changing over the course of the documentary. So she kind of started out to show that MRAs or the men rights groups are, a bunch of sexist, like whiners.
Right. And misogynistic pigs that are responsible for all the problems in the world. Yes.
Exactly. But you get to watch her mind changing over the course of the documentary. And yes, she was vilified, and they tried to pull it. Feminists tried to pull it from theaters. They were protesting against it because she's been kicked out of the tribe.
Yes, like you, I think basically her problem was that she was intellectually honest, and you can't remain a feminist for long if you're choosing intellectual honesty. So anyway, this report actually does mention. I mean, I'll read some of the stuff. They have to have a little caveat before they mention this stuff. They say, although boys and men as a group tend to hold privilege and power based on gender, like, okay, can't not mention that. By the way, there's a lot of apologizing in these guidelines. It's very clear that they're like, we're making guidelines that say they're for men and boys, but don't worry, patriarchy is a thing, and
Yeah.
you know, we know that they're privileged. So they have that, but then they say they cite some real things, right? They say that men and boys demonstrate disproportionate rates of receiving harsh discipline, academic challenges, mental health issues, physical health problems, public health concerns, and a wide variety of other quality of life issues. And then they say, additionally, many men do not seek help when they need it, and many report distinctive barriers to receiving gender-sensitive psychological treatment. And if you're interested in issues that affect men, speaking of Cassie J, I just had her website. Let me pull it up. TheRedPillMovie.com. She's got for International Men's Day last November 19th. She put together a little infographic with some of the statistics around men that maybe aren't as publicly known. Workplace deaths, suicide, you know, almost 3 to 4 times as likely to commit suicide, and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in that, you can go look at that. So, you know, on the one hand, Keri, I was kind of heartened that the APA was going to look at these issues. On the other hand, if when they look at these issues and they try and determine the root cause, if they're guided by principles that are inherently flawed, like an inherently flawed ideology, and therefore they draw the wrong conclusions about what the root causes are, then there's a big risk that their proposed solutions will actually do harm rather than be helpful, right? Yes. So instead of prescribing medicine, they'll prescribe poison. And yes. This kind of reminds me of kind of the old, I won't say ancient, but older medicine, like Western medicine prior to the discovery of germ theory, right? Or the development of germ theory, when visiting a hospital actually increased your risk of death. So you were better off actually avoiding doctors than going to a doctor, because their understanding of medicine was so rudimentary that they were going to be more harmful than helpful. And so if that's the case with the APA, maybe I'd rather they just ignore men's issues altogether. But so that's kind of the context that I approach this in.
No, I agree with you. I think there's some positive stuff about this. I do think it's positive they're finally paying attention to some of the issues affecting men and boys and you know, their psychological well-being. But unlike the Cassie J documentary, they're not open to finding out where the truth leads them. I believe they are coming into it with this ideology, which is an SJW ideology, and so they're looking at everything through that lens. And you mentioned it even in their first paragraph, the paragraph of the summary version, where they said the thing about how, men.
Well, I can read here the first 2 sentences, Keri, right? The first 2 sentences of the introduction, right? They're very explicit about being beholden to intersectional ideology, right? They say, boys and men are diverse with respect to their race, ethnicity, culture, migration status, age, socioeconomic status, ability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religious affiliation. Each of these social identities contributes uniquely and in intersecting ways to shape how men experience and perform their masculinities, which in turn contribute to relational, psychological, and behavioral health outcomes in both positive and negative ways. So those are the very first 2 sentences. They are explicitly stating right off the bat, hey, this is all about intersectionality. Identity. That's our premise here, and we're going to take it from there.
Although
I don't think that was the part that you wanted me to read, though.
It's in that same part. They say, although boys and men as a group tend to hold privilege and power based on gender. So they're taking that as a truth from the beginning. They're telling you up front, this is the ideology we believe in, and they're assuming that you do too. Like that this is taken for granted. And elsewhere within the study, they define terms, of course. And a lot of those definitions are straight out of the SJW lexicon. They define power. They define privilege. And they quote good old Peggy McIntosh, or they source her under privilege. So,
by the way, so Keith is saying that he's not seeing your video, but I am. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment if they're seeing Keri's video. That he's hearing you, but he's not seeing your video. I don't know why that is. I'm seeing it. Anyway, Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, speaking of citations, this was interesting. The guidelines, we haven't really gotten into meat of the guidelines yet, which I want to do, but there are a lot of citations, right? There's this, it leads you to believe that their claims are scientific and well researched, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why they put a lot of citations in. But if you look at the citations, in reality, many of those citations, it's a name and a date, so it feels like maybe it's pointing to a research paper. But a lot of them are pointing to things like the Peggy McIntosh article that are just like opinions written by experts in social justice, who are aligned with their ideology. And even the citations, it's important for people also to remember that even the citations that points to actual research papers need to be taken with a grain of salt here, because first of all, you're reading basically a single sentence summary of the paper that I guarantee is tainted by their postmodernist worldview. So they're interpreting it the way they want to. Some examples, like they say, policing of masculinity expression in boys by their caregivers tends to be ineffective and emotionally damaging to the child and creates tension in the relationship. And they cite, I suppose I don't even know if that's a research paper or not. That might just be an opinion, but they cite someone there. I imagine that result depends really heavily on what you mean by policing, right? Do you mean shaming and belittling a child, or do you mean providing a role model and encouraging them and setting a good example, or setting an example of masculinity? So there's a lot more complexity here, and a lot of times they just kind of, they interpret things to be whatever they want, like, oh, it's policing, right? So a lot of it really it depends on you understanding a lot more than their soundbite. And on top of that, just in case the audience doesn't know, studies in general, especially in the field of studies in psychology, are problematic. I hate to use that word because it's an SJW word, but there's a reproducibility crisis in psychology right now, which isn't surprising because the field is populated by ideologues rather than scientists. So there were researchers recently who tried to reproduce. They went and they looked at 100 papers in like the top 3 psychological journals, and they tried to reproduce the results of these papers, and they could only reproduce 39 of them, which is pretty horrific. And so there's actually this place called the Center for Open Science, and it's an organization kind of focused on identifying and solving this problem in all sciences, but maybe with special attention to psychology, because they do have such a problem. So there's lots of like weird correlation is causality mistakes and interpretations of things, and then we're not even really sure about the underlying studies in many cases. So I just want to point out that if you read the guidelines, it looks, there's lots of citations which
it looks
will
legit.
Make you feel like it's legit, but they're paper tigers, or maybe I don't know what a better analogy is. There's straw man citations for the large part, or just people interpreting stuff the way they want to. So
right. And they're just they're speaking as if a lot of this is a given, as if it's true. Like they refer to the patriarchy as if, the patriarchy, it's the thing. And just it's, you're supposed to be on the same page with them already on that stuff. So I noticed other people in the chat are saying nobody can see me. So you can see me. So it must be not on my end, right?
I can see you. Yeah, let me see if I'm controlling the chat, so like I'm not hiding you from the broadcast or anything. There's no like your camera's not like turned off. I can turn it off and back on. Well, let me do that.
Okay.
I turned your camera off and back on. I hope that works.
Real quick. Yeah.
Okay, if it doesn't, I apologize, but yeah, I have no idea why you are not visible, Keri. So,
oh well. It's probably for the best. Now I can blow my nose in privacy.
You can't. Well, but people will hear you. So let's. True. So okay. I'm sorry you're going to miss Keri's smiling face. If it's still not working, it works to me, and I see your picture down there in the corner and on the screen in front of me. So anyway, let's go through really quickly. Let's maybe just there's 10 guidelines. So I think we can get off into the weeds and we can start talking about about our reactions to this, but let's just present what the 10 guidelines are, the way they're worded in the report, and then maybe we can talk about the substance behind them.
Okay.
We won't have time to do all of them, but we can talk about the general substance behind them. So first of all, I don't know if, I guess all APA reports or guidelines are written like this. It's kind of weird language that they use. The guidelines all are written in this kind of form. Guideline number 1 is, psychologists strive to recognize that masculinities are constructed based on social, cultural, and contextual norms. So just the language was weird to me at first, because it wasn't like psychologists should do this. It was like psychologists do this. It made me feel like I was in a Montessori kindergarten, where it was like, we choose our works now and we do, this is what we do. It's like, okay, why are you talking to me like that? But anyway, that's how they talk to you. So they say psychologists strive to recognize that masculinities are constructed based on social, cultural, and contextual norms. That's social constructionism 101. So that's guideline number 1. Guideline number 1 is basically be an SJW. Guideline number 2. Psychologists strive to recognize that boys and men integrate multiple aspects of their social identities across the lifespan. So that basically is like, it's a homage to intersectionality, plus, hey, you know, people age, and so things change, duh.
Right.
Number 3 is psychologists understand the impact of power, privilege, and sexism on the development of boys and men and on their relationship with others.
Here we go.
Yep, power and privilege. There we go. Number 4, psychologists strive to develop a comprehensive understanding of the factors that influence the interpersonal relationships of boys and men. Basically, that one, for the ones that I have a 1-sentence summary, I'll give it to you while I read it. The summary of that one for me was basically, men have the wrong kind of relationships, and they need to have relationships like women do.
Yeah.
Number 5 is psychologists strive to encourage positive father involvement and healthy family relationships. I want to talk about that one more, because the title excited me a little bit, but it left me wanting after I read it. Number 6 is psychologists strive to support educational efforts that are responsive to the needs of boys and men. Again, sounds like maybe could be interesting. Isn't. We'll talk about that. Number 7, psychologists strive to reduce the high rates of problems boys and men face and act out in their lives, such as aggression and violence. And there's a comma there, so I don't know if I missed the rest of it, but whatever. Probably other stuff. Here, let me look. Aggression, violence, substance abuse, and suicide. All right. Number 8, psychologists strive to help boys and men engage in health-related behaviors. Okay. Number 9, psychologists strive to build and promote gender-sensitive psychological services. And number 10, psychologists understand and strive to change institutional, cultural, and systemic problems that affect boys and men through advocacy, prevention, and education. This last guideline was basically lobby for the shit that we want you to lobby for. And we've got a political agenda, and psychologists, they lobby for our political agenda.
I had a big problem with that one too. Are we going to go through each of these individually?
I don't think there's a couple I want to point out and highlight, but I just wanted to just put them all out on the table first before I think we can have a general discussion about our observations regarding the guidelines as a whole. And if we want to talk about a few, we can, but I don't think it's worth going through each individual one, because frankly, a lot of them are just intersectionality regurgitations of the previous one with a shift. It's like, hey, intersectionality. Hey, also intersectionality plus age. Hey, also, whatever. So what were I've got a few high level observations, things that I think were wrong with this report, or things that bothered me. But what is your kind of high level assessment of this report or this guidelines?
Well, I feel like I've stated it already, sort of, but just that they have good intent, it seems to me. They're trying to explain some of the things that men's rights activists talk about a lot, some of the things that men's rights activists highlight, like the high suicide rates, but they're trying to shoehorn it into their existing SJW narrative. So there are certain things that just don't make sense to me. For example, they talk about the suicide rates of boys and men are climbing. And, you know, within a 15-year period, I think among white men, they increased 28%. But they're saying that these ill effects are because of traditional masculinity, which is harmful. Well, why are we seeing the suicide rates of men increasing if we've been smashing the patriarchy and dismantling traditional masculinity for the past 15 years? If traditional masculinity is the problem, then why are things getting worse? Because we're attacking traditional masculinity. We're smashing that patriarchy, you know? So
right. Absolutely. Men should be, as we become less, quote, traditionally masculine, we should be happier and less depressed, less suicidal. Things should be going better for men.
Right. And I think that on its face, I'm like, how can you guys cite that and then not recognize that you're blaming on something that has been an institution that has been attacked and is declining? I think they would agree traditional masculinity is not held up as something to aspire towards, as you know, in the way that it used to be.
Well, I'm not sure if they would agree with that because they seem to be quite blind about a lot of things, but I think most reasonable people would. I mean, it's, you know, I read this report, I made notes on all of the guidelines, but I really struggled with, like, what's my overall impression of this? Because they like touch on a few topics that I'm like, oh, good, they're touching on this, but they don't talk about it in a satisfying way. And so I tried to think about what the report really symbolized to me. And the conclusion that I drew was this report is not about men. First of all, I had a couple conclusions. One is it's not about men. The guidelines are largely focused on helping gender nonconformists cope with masculinity and helping other marginalized groups cope with what they call the Eurocentric concept of masculinity. There's not a lot of focus on like men who identify as male and are cisgendered men who identify as masculine. So it really seems to me not about actually helping men, but really about, as you said, just blaming masculinity for men's problems and saying men have a lot of problems and masculinity is the root cause. So it really isn't even about helping men to start with. I don't know if you got that sense, but that was the sense that I got.
I agree to an extent. Yeah, I think some people, I think it's easy to self-delude yourself and think you are trying to help men. But what you're trying to, what you're, maybe you've convinced. Well,
but nowhere in the report, right? Nowhere do they examine. They don't even ask the question of whether the vilification of masculinity in culture has a negative effect on men and boys. It's not even brought up as a possibility to explore.
I have a whole list of things they don't bring up. Like they don't talk about, really, they talk about fatherhood, but they don't talk about the impact of destroying the traditional family and the lack of fathers in the home.
Well, really? So that's interesting. Really. Yeah, no, that was one of the ones that bothered me a lot because I'm reading the guideline. The guideline is psychologists strive to encourage positive father involvement and healthy family relationships, right? And when I read this, I was like, oh, finally, they're gonna talk about the importance of fathers and male role models for young boys. Because, you know, look, young boys grow up in a very gynocentric world. There's a lot of single motherhood, first of all. And even when there's not a lot of single motherhood, mothers are traditionally the primary caregivers during their early years. And then they go to preschool and elementary school and high school where it is overwhelmingly run by women. So it's there's a deplorable lack of male role models for young boys. And I thought, oh, good, they're gonna talk about how if you're a psychologist, you need to really help young boys find masculine role models that they can use as substitutes for missing or absent fathers or just lack of men in their lives in general. But that's not what it was about. There was basically only two main points to that. The first was that kind of this generalized, like, point, which is father involvement is good for kids in a general sense. In fact, they don't mention father involvement being important for boys, but they actually, in this guidelines to how to help men and boys, for adolescents, father involvement has been associated with healthier eating patterns, lower internalizing problems, especially for daughters. They're still focused on like fucking girls. Like, I get it. I have a daughter. I care about girls, but this report is supposed to be about guidelines for helping boys and men. And they're still just viewed as like, hey, it's good for kids. By the way, you should be a good father. Like, thanks for the guideline.
Hey, I want to butt in there and say something, because I sent you this article right before we started. I'm sure you didn't have time to read it, but they don't believe in the importance of having healthy male role models. They don't believe that it's necessary. And so there was an article that came out at the end of the year, or just came out at the beginning of the year, in the New Yorker. I'm just going to pull it up here to make sure I get this right. It was called The Year in Good Men by Naomi Fry, staff reporter at the New Yorker. And she basically was trying to say, it's been such a horribly sexist, awful year, but let's try and compile a list of good men this year. Her list starts off with a mascot from a sports team, like not a real man. And then she goes on to list a duck, like an actual duck. I don't know if it was in the news. A steer, a duck that was in the news, a steer that was in the news. She mentions a couple of actors, and she specifically mentions these actors because they are playing, quote, the sensitive teenage boy, slender, complex, and tortured boys, fine-boned, gentle-eyed. Like this whole list is not really about masculine role models. Like, several of the people on the list aren't actual humans.
Yeah, I mean, of the 7 billion people in the world, roughly 3.5 billion are male. I can't find 10 that are worth that are more admirable than a duck. So that's
or a mascot.
Yes,
yeah. So
thank you.
That to me is just a cultural. That's just an example of how they don't really. They don't view it as important to have.
Well, Keri, I'm going to show. Not only do they not view it as important, I'm going to show what you sent me. This picture. I don't know if Keri, if you can see it, but it is okay. So this is actually.
No, wait. Let me just back up here. So after I sent it to you, I just did my due diligence to make sure this was real, and I'm not sure because there's no timestamp on it. However,
so it could be like a fake.
It could be. However, it jives with a lot of the things that she has said, and even if it's not real, this is a sentiment that I've seen expressed in multiple ways.
I've seen this before too, as abhorrent as it is. Let me just read it for people who aren't watching and are just listening. It is a tweet by someone named Kate Morgan, if it's real. And she says, if you're a white woman and are currently pregnant with a white baby boy, do us all a favor and take a trip to Planned Parenthood. So that kind of sentiment, which is common, apparently doesn't need to be addressed at all in society, and the problem is masculinity. So yeah, I mean
you can see stuff like that in that sentiment expressed by who's the New York Times op-ed writer they just hired, or maybe not op-ed, Sarah Zhang. She expresses stuff like that all the time. And it's
she does.
Very common in the SJW world.
Well, getting back to this father thing, the two things that I thought were missing was what we just talked about, role models, like not really any discussion of boys needing masculine or male role models. And the second thing that actually Cassie J talks about a lot in the Red Pill movie is there was no discussion in this entire document about really, I don't think it was even mentioned. There was no discussion about the family court system and how devastating it is to fathers and men generally. And there's I think maybe they mentioned it. I think there was maybe a sentence that gave it a passing mention somewhere, but there was no treatment of that as an issue and how to deal with it or anything like that. It was just kind of ignored. So, to me, some of the issues that little boys face is the court system ripping their fathers away generally, and lack of male role models. in general, including absent fathers. And then from the father side, issues that they face, losing their kids through a court system like this. Frankly, if you're a young man in college, you probably worry about being falsely accused of sexual harassment or rape. You know, I know.
Or a man
I know
who's
people
appointed to the Supreme Court. You might worry about that.
Sure. Well, even like even regular people, right? So I spent a long time mentoring. I still mentor and advise startup founders, and I spent a lot of time as an angel investor here in Silicon Valley. And I used to advise women founders. I think actually disproportionately, because they would seek out help more. I found they would seek out help more than male founders tended to, and so I would advise them. I've actually, you call me sexist for this, but I'm not taking on any new female founders to advise at all, because I'm paranoid about being in the same room without like recording devices or something. Like I don't want to ever be accused of something that I didn't do. And
that's a shame, but that is not. It's completely understandable, and I've seen that expressed elsewhere.
And even
that is happening.
My last venture firm, I had a rule. So we had our office manager. I told him, look, whenever we have a meeting with a female, you also have to be present. Like we both have to be there, because I don't want to have a closed door meeting with a female founder. And that's stupid. I should be able to do that. But
if you live in a world that says believe all women instead of believe evidence, then that's a natural consequence.
Yeah. So let's talk about. Do you have anything else to add about that particular guideline?
I did see them, and I'm forgetting where, but I did see them mention the way that what was it? That men are disproportionately affected. You were talking about the court system.
Yeah, I think they did, like towards the end. I think in passing once they did, but they didn't really give it any treatment.
Yeah,
right.
It's not like they paid attention to it. I had a thought there. Maybe it'll come to me in a minute. But
well, and the other thing is like they talk about the media, for example, and they talk about like, oh, there's these I know, hyper masculine role models in the media, right? So you think about people like The Rock, or maybe for the older generation, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or be like, big, muscly, hyper masculine guys. But there's never a discussion of, as long as I've been alive and remember television, I'm struggling to think of any television show that portrayed a father as anything other than dumb and lazy. There's no discussion of that.
That's become the trope. Men are useless around the house.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm about to release I wrote an article, which I haven't posted yet, but I'm about to release a video of it as well, about Christina Wong's Radical Cram School. And one thing I didn't mention in that article is there's a girl there that in the Radical Cram School that she says, I wish I can be a boy, so when I grow up to be a father, I don't have to think about a zillion things. And mothers think about like 1,000 zillion things. Wow. And Christina's response is like, so what are the few things fathers... So she accepts that. She doesn't argue with it. So what are the few things fathers have to think about? And the girl says, well, resting. And Christina is like, yeah, resting. Yeah. So that's
we should mention here, just full disclosure, I have Christina as a friend, and I used to represent her. She's a comedian. I used to represent.
Yeah, but I'm allowed to talk smack about Christina.
You can have whatever opinions you want. I have some of my own about that piece. So, but anyway, what was I going to say? So it came to me. What I was going to say. It did mention at some point how men are maybe not as believed as women when it comes to issues of domestic abuse, or they're not being served when it comes to domestic abuse. But they didn't really get into that. It did mention that, but they didn't get deep into that. And part of this whole
they didn't even get shallow into it. I think they mentioned it in like one sentence
in passing. But this believe all women culture that we're in now is just going to make that worse. So of course. I mean, I know from personal, like, anecdotal evidence of police being called when a woman is abusing a man, and the man being arrested, like, because the woman said it was the man who did it, who started it, and that's definitely something I think that exists, but I think this current climate is going to make that worse.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, it will. I'm going to say something kind of hyperbolic, but I want to talk about why the context through which these issues are approached kind of matters more than maybe it would seem on the surface, because I think it really does matter. And it turns this stuff into poison where it could be helpful. My hyperbolic statement is I don't think that they believe men actually exist, really. I think they believe that there are concepts of masculinity that exists, right? But they don't believe that those concepts reflect really anything real about people born with XY chromosomes. So, like, in other words, they don't think that these concepts, they don't think that this concept of masculinity evolved from like anything biologically relevant or advantageous. I always think of the concept of
social.
Right. And I always think of the concept of masculinity as arising from like, you observe behavior of successful men, you identify commonalities of them, you distill those commonalities down to certain traits, you create this idea of like an idealized image of a man, you call him, you define him as masculine, and like, and that's where that concept comes from. But in their view, that's not it. To them, masculinity has nothing to do fundamentally with who men are. It's just an arbitrary social construct. God knows how they think we came up with that construct in the first place, but they sure as hell don't think it's real or useful, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Well, no, I can kind of see what you're saying there. They view, I think it's said before, like, it's almost that they view men as defective women. Is that
yeah. Well, but let me give you an example from the report. Okay. So let me be clear. So like they assume in this report, in this guideline, I keep saying report, it's a guideline. In these guidelines, they assume that, for example, that men's desire to be providers for their families is part of this social construct called masculinity, right? And that the solution here involves like evolving men's roles in society, basically changing men to fight this construct, right?
So
that dismantle
this. So they don't feel like they need to provide for the family.
Right. Right. But here's the question I think we need to ask, right? Does the desire to be a provider, is it really a social construct? I mean, look out your window at the animal world, right? You will see male birds building elaborate nests for females, and females going and checking them out, and instinctually choosing the ones that they think, the mates that they think will be the best and provide the best resources. Isn't it possible that the desire to provide resources and be a provider is something that's kind of deeply biological and ingrained? Well, and if that's the case, if we try and dismantle it, aren't we kind of destroying man qua man? We're like don't exist as a man. What do they think will happen in a world like that?
Well, Peterson has talked about this before. I mean, women are pregnant for 9 months, and then they need to be with the young baby for a period of time after that. And so it's involved that necessarily the partner is going to help to support the woman during that time. And that's to go out. I think it's deeply biological.
Of course, it's at least something. I mean, I'm not arguing that there's maybe no social influence, but correct. It's pretty ludicrous to just discount the biological influence, just dismiss it out of hand, especially when you just, like I said, look out your window, look at nature, watch how species interact, like watch how male and female of a variety of species interact, including mammals.
Have you heard about the case of David Reimer? Do you know who that is?
Who?
David Reimer. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but Reimer.
I haven't.
This is a little boy who was born, and during something happened during the birth where he lost part of his genitals, or he was born maybe with something deformed. I can't remember. So anyway, the doctor and the parents made the choice to castrate him and to tell him he was a girl and raise him as a girl. And he was being studied by this postmodernist, forget the doctor's name right now, but he was being studied by this guy who wrote a lot of what ended up becoming the like the transgender activist Bible. I don't that gender is completely a social construct. And he was holding David out as an example of that. But if it's a social construct, David never felt like a girl. He was told he was a girl, he was raised as a girl, and he ended up having huge psychological problems because of it, because he felt like he was a boy.
Right. I mean, the whole concept of transgenderism presupposes that there are sexes, right? It's like, how can you say you identify as the opposite gender if there is no opposite gender? That's a separate issue.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't seem to get too far afield, but just I think that case is a great example of, they tried to use it to say, oh, look, it's all social. You can raise this boy as a girl and he'll be a girl. And it wasn't social. So
it didn't work, basically.
Didn't work.
Yeah. By the way, so Embarrassing Mom mentions also penguins are a good example. Another bird dads bring food for the young. But there are a couple requests, Keri, for you to speak about the sexual appeal that large masculine men have for straight women and why feminists don't want to admit it. So
people are asking for that.
A couple people. It's been someone asked for it and then it was seconded. So well, I think you should. You should address that very important issue.
I don't know. I think there's been a lot of interesting discussion about that recently. Again, to talk about, I think Peterson touched on this, that feminists like to pretend like they don't want a traditionally masculine man, and that's not something that is desirable. Yet at the same time that we've been emasculating men, and I don't know if you've seen like the rapidly declining testosterone rates among men.
They have been dropping, which, by the way, is evidence that masculinity as a concept is dissipating, and so we should be happier that our testosterone is dropping. But separate issue.
Right, I guess so. But so as that's been happening, you also simultaneously see this rise in women seeking out the extreme opposite. So you have the insane popularity of books like 50 Shades of Grey, where it's not just masculinity, it's a woman being, I haven't read it, but a woman being, right, is the S&M. It's like taking it to the extreme.
Right. So, it's maybe where the term toxic masculinity might be appropriate.
Well, maybe where it should be appropriate, because what I've heard about that book is he's kind of a dick towards her too. That it's not just in the bedroom. So anyway, because women are repressing this desire for masculine men, that you're seeing it surface in other ways. And when Peterson talked about it, he had a really interesting comment. He said, if you look at, I think it was a bunch of Google engineers or someone at Google did a study about or it was included in a book, a study about the terms that women search for. Like when women are looking for erotic novels, like romance novels, that the top 3 things they're looking for are, the men are either like physicians, is it surgeons or something? Doctors. The men are doctors, or the men are pirates, or the men are werewolves. But these dominant masculine kind of, they're like these beasts that women get to domesticate.
Well, look, I mean, it's not talked about a lot, but it is widely recognized that a lot of women have rape fantasies.
Women search for that more than men do in porn. If you look at porn stats, women look for that. They look up that kind of porn more than men do.
Right, and that might be a result of the lack of finding masculine men around them. So there's kind of this pent up fetishization of masculinity in some sense, and it gets turned into a werewolf or whatever you said they search for.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, I'd like your thoughts on this. I was, the other thing I thought about, I took away from these guidelines is, I was wondering if you're going to look at societal problems, I'm not sure if it's possible to really look at men and women in isolation. Men and women's psychologies and our gender roles evolved as sort of a symbiotic relationship with one another. And so, they complain about, this report laments the fact that, men are more aggressive. They eat fewer vegetables. So that's risk taking, I guess, and stuff like that. And, there's testosterone is why men take more risks and are more aggressive. And frankly, testosterone is super valuable to society. It's not a bad thing. In fact, if you think historically, aggression and risk taking were crucial to the survival of humanity. Especially when you're out hunting, you've got to go take risks and be aggressive. And the thing is, it's just not very useful at home. It's not very useful. I guess in a civilized society, maybe it needs to be channeled. But what I was thinking about this is like, look, men don't exist in a vacuum. We don't procreate by ourselves. We need partners. And in fact, we need female partners. And we need female partners who, for the most part, have complementary psychology. So, when a man spends time with his children, his testosterone levels go down. Therefore, his aggression goes down. When he spends time with his wife, I can attest to this. When he spends time with his wife, he eats more vegetables. Like, she's there to be like, eat your fucking vegetables. That's part of the dynamic. And I'm wondering if really to viewing psychological health of one gender in isolation, maybe you're only going to get a partial picture, because maybe our psychologies aren't meant to be in isolation. Maybe men are meant to have a counterbalance in their life from a woman. And maybe women are meant to have some of that aggression and risk-taking into their lives to propel them to do things and to kind of let go of their children and let them grow up.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying that men need women?
And women need men, yeah.
And families.
Shoot me now, Bay Area.
It's so controversial.
I know.
Yes.
But I don't know. What are your? I just came up with that. What are your thoughts about?
No, I think it's a great point. I was taking notes while you're talking about it. They don't talk about it. They're just isolating men out here, but they're looking at it through this gendered lens, which they admit from the beginning of the study or the beginning of the guidelines. They say that the reason they did this is because once they started looking at psychology through a quote gendered lens, in order to write guidelines for women, which they did a decade ago or so, that then they realized that a lot of these same people who specialized in femininity now specialize in masculinity. And they realized the necessity to look at psychology through this gendered lens for men. And so they're isolating it. They're looking at it through the lens of gender. They're not looking at it through the lens of family, traditional masculinity, tradition at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, it's hard because I think, I'm a vocal advocate of therapy for men and women. But it's quite difficult. I think if this is I guess I'm an advocate for therapy, but not therapists. I mean, if this is what most therapists believe, I don't know that a guy going to visit a therapist is going to be helpful. I think it actually might make his problems worse. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. And let me just put in there really quickly. It's going to make it worse because there's one part in here where they say it's the clinician's imperative to fight. What is it? Homophobia, transphobia, to fight against homophobia, transphobia, racial bias, and other types of discrimination in institutions such as the criminal justice system. That's part of the clinician's responsibility.
Right, that's part of their advocacy stuff.
The clinician as activist.
Yeah, it's really weird, and it's like they simultaneously are like, gee, men avoid therapy, but like if this is what therapists believe about men, no wonder they avoid therapy. Like you should avoid therapy. Maybe just find an older guy who you think has his shit together and use him as a mentor. And open up and talk to him. But I don't know. It's like they should avoid therapy if this is what therapy is going to deliver to them. If therapy is going to try and tear down their concepts of masculinity. And, you sent an article to me I think it was in, I think I'm almost 100% sure that it was in reaction to this APA guidelines, the article that you posted on Facebook. But it was about this concept that like, kind of no pain, no gain, but this, you have to do hard things to grow and mature. And it's not clear to me that, you know, they talk about like, oh, it's tough for men to live up to this masculine ideal. Like, yeah, but we all know that we're not the ideal, right? Mm-hmm. But that pressure to compare yourself to the ideal, at least on some level, I mean, not maniacally, but on some level to know that ideal's there, that pressure is actually kind of positive in many ways. It spurs you to better yourself. Mm-hmm. And so going to a therapist, it's like, you know, it's okay. You don't have to do any hard work. You don't have to lift weights because you don't have to be strong. It's like, well, you don't have to, but it's healthy. And frankly, when you do lift weights, your testosterone levels rise and you have a lot more energy and you become more assertive and aggressive, which I know they think is bad, but is absolutely valuable, and your family relies on it. If you're in a traditional role model in your family. So I'm not sure I should really still be advocating therapy for men, because if this is what they're going to get,
if you're getting
fuck it.
Kind of therapist, yeah.
That's
why. People are gravitating towards these male thinkers now who are outside of this PC SJW ideology, or who are speaking against it. And obviously part of that is because they're looking for and craving male role models who are not ducks or sports mascots or fey teenage angsty boys.
Right. That's part of Jordan Peterson's appeal. In fact, I think that's predominantly his appeal. He's a smart guy, and I love listening to him eviscerate idiotic interviewers. Mm-hmm. But really, what he brings to the table isn't a lot of knowledge that other professors may not have or other smart men may not have, but he kind of embraces his masculinity and provides this male role model to young men. And frankly, I think that male role model is important to young women because, you know, women
absolutely. His
women need to see what is like what men could and should be, or what's possible in men. And so especially, you know, younger men aren't very mature and developed. So for example, my daughter is going to be looking at me as the image of, well, this is what a successful man looks like. This is the model that I should pattern my search for a partner after. Now, I'm sure there's some things that she shouldn't do there, and I'll have a conversation with her about my flaws, and don't go for those things. But we all, you know, guys tend to use their mothers as role models for their sexual partners or templates, and girls tend to use their fathers as templates. And so it also does affect girls pretty significantly.
Absolutely. And I think that's why these same thinkers these non-SJW anti-PC thinkers are appealing to women now too. And I keep being told that Peterson's audience is all male. I've seen that lie repeated often. It is not all male. I host a book club, the Jordan Peterson book club. We started it with his book 12 Rules, and almost everyone who showed up for the video discussion is women. And you know, I've been to his lecture. It's about 45-50% women. So there's this lie that this is only appealing to men, and it's simply not true. I think everyone is craving a positive male representation of the male role model.
Sure, and maybe that's why, you know, women they find the kind of non-masculine guys who can fulfill you know, some of their needs, but are missing that masculinity, and they have to go out and seek the quote the bad boy or the 50 Shades of Grey guy to get themselves turned on and excited about masculinity, because they can't find it anywhere else.
They can't find it anywhere else, and they almost have to go to. It's like it's uncool to like a traditionally masculine guy, but if you go further than that, then you get into kink territory. Then that's cool.
Yeah. Well, and look, from a male perspective, right? It's not okay to be a traditionally masculine guy, but it might be okay to be like a psychotic 50 Shades of Grey. I forget his name, but like, I want to say Dorian Gray, but that's the painting. Anyway, it might be, it might be psychotic. It might be okay to be like, okay, well, if I'm going to be a regular guy, I can't be too masculine unless I want to embrace this like role as a kinky dom. And then I have to be hyper masculine. And there's no room to just be masculine without being a dick.
Yes.
Right? There's no room.
That should have been the title of our podcast today.
Yes. I have a way with words. The other thing that these guidelines do, I think, is they conflate, and this really bothers me as well, and I touched on it before, but I want to make it explicit. They conflate outcomes of masculine traits, like both positive and negative outcomes of masculine traits, in all as one thing, and use them to condemn masculinity. So it would be like me saying, well, the essence of femininity is being emotional. Hate is an emotion. Therefore, femininity is about hate. Like but that's what they do with masculinity. They're like, well, masculinity is about aggression, and aggression is like unprovoked violence and domestic abuse. Therefore, masculinity is toxic. It's like, that's not, masculinity is a lot of things, and it can manifest in toxic ways, absolutely, but so can femininity, as anyone who's dated like psychotically manipulative women can attest to. Women can be horrible creatures, just like men. They're horrible creatures in different ways. And it's not femininity that's the problem, just like it's not masculinity that's the problem.
I mean, there's a stat I heard about that when it comes to domestic abuse, for example, women actually physically hit and attack their partners more than men do. It's just that when men do it, it's a lot worse. It has the consequences are a lot worse.
Right.
The one thing I was going to mention before, because I know we have to wrap up soon, but just to get back to some of these SJW terms quickly, and because I always like to point out their hypocrisy, they are simultaneously saying here that masculinity is harmful because it doesn't allow for men to express their emotions, and that men should be able to tap into and express their emotions, which I agree with. That men should be able to, but at the same time, these are the same women who when a man disagrees with them, or if a man expresses, being upset about something they've said or what have you, they love to say, they use this phrase, male tears. They make fun of guys and use the phrase male tears. And
yep.
and that's a way for them to insult you and denigrate you as a man. Male tears. So they're hypocrites. And some of the other stuff, it's funny, I thought that in this APA guidelines, at least in the, I can't remember if it was in the summary version or the full version, but they mentioned the terms mansplaining and menspreading. Did they? Oh, no, I'm confusing it with a different article. The one that...
I don't think they did. I think that was the article on toxic masculinity that you sent me.
Never mind. But that, those terms are also used to, by SJWs to attack men. Mansplaining, for example, which originated, I believe it originated when a female author wrote a piece about how she was at a party and a man started explaining a book that he had read to her, and it was her own book. So, and she's like, yeah, I wrote that. And he just kept explaining like he knew more about it than her. And that word at the time, I'm like, yes, I've been around men like that. It's when they're they're in a chauvinist way explaining something that better than they do. It's very specific. It's like if you're a doctor and there's a guy who's not a doctor, but he's telling you all about your own field,
right?
And he's doing it to show off either to you or to some other woman who's around or what have you. That definitely, I understand. There are uses for that word that I understand. But what's come to happen is now they just use that word to mean anytime a man disagrees with you or explains anything, or if he's not on board with the ideology and his mouth is moving, he's mansplaining. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I would push back on mansplaining as a term generally, though, because I've had women do the same thing to me, right? If
okay.
you know, there are things that I can't talk about that they feel like women are experts in, and it's like, well, let me explain how that works. But I'm like, yeah, I fucking just read 3 books on the subject. Like, you're just using your intuition.
Maybe it should just be called arrogance explaining.
Yeah, that's what it is, right? And frankly, not all of it is even arrogant. I mean, some of it is arrogance and show off, but a lot of it, you know, people don't know. People aren't omniscient. I don't know the entire context of your brain. So when we're having a conversation, sometimes I will explain things that you already know really well, and you have to voice back to me, yes, I understand that. In fact, I wrote a book on it. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, this
let's now go deeper and tell me some stuff, right? But it's not. Feminists will often throw around mansplaining. As soon as you say anything, it's mansplaining.
I agree, but you're not a man. You're not an arrogant explainer or whatever, Carter. So yes, if I told you, hey, I wrote a book about
no, let me explain. Yeah. I am an arrogant explainer. So
this is a funny ending to this one.
Dumb broad.
I'm figured I'm going to log off now.
So look, maybe we should. You know, we're kind of getting to the end. We do have someone who admitted to be inherently evil in the chat, which is great. But
I saw one guy said he's going to go for Halloween as a Dr. Pirate werewolf.
He will get some play by going as the Dr. Pirate werewolf. Yeah. So look, I think, you know, the summary, the takeaway for me is, at first I approached this and I saw the guidelines and I thought, okay, well, you know, after my kind of just skimming and reading only the guidelines before I read it deeper, my initial reaction was, okay, there's some good in here, but they've probably messed it up. There's a lot of messy stuff, right? Having read it now and also discussed it with you, my take on these APA guidelines are, I wish that they didn't exist because I think they're more harmful than good. I think a therapist who wants to work with men is actually interested in men and masculinity and probably respects them because they're seeking out or at least accepting male and boy clients. And so they're probably better off using their own judgment and intuition on how to deal with people on a individual basis than by reading this thing and having the entire framework by which they view their clients altered to match this kind of anti-masculine intersectionality patriarchy myth ideology. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it's probably going to do more harm than good because it's ideologically based. It's not truth driven. One other thing that they didn't touch on that I think is a problem with boys is that they are over medicated. They're overly diagnosed with ADHD by people who that aggression and competitiveness and all, hyperactivity and all those problems.
Yes. And I know we were going to wrap up, but can we talk about the school section for just a minute? Because that was another one. Schools bother the hell out of me. The way that schools treat young boys is, the way that government schools treat kids generally is, it's better to be in a prison. Prisoners get more free time, time to themselves and self-directed activities. But, the way that they treat young boys, the idea that a young boy is expected to sit at a desk quietly for hours on end and only get up after, only get up once in a while for bathroom breaks and have 15 minutes or 45 minutes or whatever it is for recess in the middle of the day and go back to sitting and listening and having their focus broken. So you get really into something, you're in flow, you're learning your math, bell rings, now it's time for English. Don't squirm around, don't have any extra energy. Just sit there like a robot or a sponge and absorb the mostly crap that's being taught at you. Of course they act out, right? And they do mention in these guidelines, boys act out differently than women. Girls tend to internalize their problems, and boys tend to choose external methods of expressing their frustration. So so they start acting out, and what's the solution? Drug them, which is child abuse, frankly. And what you should do if you have a little boy is just pull him the hell out of school, like homeschool him, send him somewhere else, move to a school district that is sensitive to this or something. But sending them to these schools and where they are treated like someone mentioned this in the chat, sending them to these schools where they're treated like broken girls is just about one of the worst things you can do for them.
I agree. My whole opinion on homeschooling has changed in the past few years, and you and I talked about this offline. But I think part of that is because the people who are homeschooling now, the people who are homeschooling has changed. So in the past, 20 years ago, when I was a young and vibrant SJW, a budding SJW, a lot of the people, the homeschoolers I interacted with in the South, like in North Carolina, were fundamentalist Christians who did not believe in evolution. And that was the reason they were homeschooling. And I met some of these people while doing tours at a primate center where I wasn't allowed to talk about evolution or primate characteristics or fossil record or anything. So I had a negative opinion of it. But now there are more people homeschooling because they don't want their children's heads full of this SJW ideology. They don't want their kids being indoctrinated in this way. And so I think my opinions on it have definitely changed. If I had a kid, I would not put them in public school.
Well, we should do an entire episode on or more on early childhood education, because I think there's a lot to talk about there. We did run over time, so that's great. I love running over time. Thanks for everyone for being in the chat. It was a cool chat. We got to talk about people being naturally evil. Actually, if you read the chat, polygamy and cuckoldry are part of the discussion. So there's lots of craziness in the chat. But Keri, any final thoughts on these guidelines you want to leave people with before we sign off?
I don't think so. I think I've said what I had to say. What about you? Final thoughts?
I think I've mostly said what I had to say. I would just say I like the idea of therapy, but be very careful. Be very careful if you're going to pick a therapist.
And let boys be boys. That's yes. The final thought, right?
Let boys be boys.
And let boys be boys. I saw
and find good role models for them. Help boys identify positive role models.
Yeah. Owen Benjamin talked about his wife being in I think it was like a gymnastics class for his son, and how one of the other little boys in the class was wearing a shirt that said, "Boys will be boys," and the second boys was crossed out. So and then over it was written, "Good humans. Boys will be good humans." And there's something really kind of disturbing about that. And it's not okay for the boy. I mean, of course, everyone should be a good human, but it's not okay for the boy to be a boy. It's like erasing men. Like you said, it's like men don't exist, boys don't exist.
Well, I think honestly, I think erasing men may be the goal here. So I don't know how that'll work out for the species, but I guess we'll see. So thank you once again, Keri. Thanks to everyone for watching. You can find Keri and I at on this channel every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Texas time, which is where Keri is. And the show's called Deprogrammed. You can find audio versions of it by looking for Unsafe Space on your favorite podcast app. And obviously our YouTube channel, if you're watching now, is Unsafe Space. Please go to unsafeshow.com to find out ways to support the show, like, share, subscribe, anything you can do to spread the word. We're just starting out. So, really anything you can do to spread the word will really help us out a lot. And if you care about these issues, join the chat, spread the word. Oh, well, Keri, we also have a Facebook and we have Facebook pages for Deprogrammed and Unsafe Space generally. So
yeah, we have two. So share the video if you like it.
All righty. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.